I want to thank you all for making it out tonight. Um, but tonight's kind of a special night, because it's the last night that a lot of us college students are going to be around. A lot of them are heading out tomorrow morning, I guess. Not me though. Y'all are still stuck with me until Sunday. So this quarter, we've turned our attention to the topic of miracles. Those are the events that are described in the Bible where God basically sticks his hand into our world and then makes something happen, something that can't be explained using any of the natural laws that govern our universe. So the parting of the Red Sea in Exodus, to use an example, completely defies what we know about gravity and fluid dynamics, so it can't really be called anything but a miracle. In most of the classes that we have lined up for this quarter, we're looking at broad categories of miracles. Miracles of provision, healings, casting out demons. Tonight, though, I want to focus on one very specific miracle that can't easily be grouped into our larger category. Turn over to Matthew chapter 21, and I'll start reading in verse 18. Matthew 21, verse 18. In the morning, as he was returning to the city, he became hungry. And seeing a fig tree by the wayside, he, that is Jesus, went to it and found nothing on it but only leaves. And he said to it, "May no fruit ever come from you again." And the fig tree withered at once. This is kind of a strange story, and it stands out as especially strange when you compare it with the other miracles that Jesus performed. If I asked you to give me an example of a miracle that Jesus performed somewhere else in the New Testament, what comes to mind first? Healing.
Walking on water.
Walking on water.
Turn the water into wine.
Absolutely. And then you have like the feeding of the 5,000, the raising of Lazarus, all these other kinds of miracles. And what a lot of them have in common is that they're restorative or they're protective. So Jesus raised Lazarus back to life. He fed the 5,000 with food so they wouldn't go hungry. And he calmed the storm at sea that threatened the lives of his disciples. The overarching goal of his miracles was to give weight to his claim that he was the Son of God. But the specific miracles chosen also reveal a lot about the character of Jesus. He loves people, he looks after people, and he has a vested interest in our salvation. That's why when you look at some of the one of the rejected Gospels, you notice that one of the things that sets them apart from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is how Jesus is portrayed. And perhaps the most infamous of these is perhaps the infancy Gospel of Thomas, which was written perhaps in the 2nd or 3rd century and claimed the Apostle Thomas as its author. It contains several short stories from the childhood of Jesus, supposedly, and this is one of them. Next, he was going through the village again, and a running child bumped his shoulder. Becoming bitter, Jesus said to him, "You will not complete your journey." Immediately, he fell down and died. I don't really have to ask you all what's wrong with this story. I think we can tell. The miracle that Jesus is said to have performed here is so destructive and wrathful that it's very much at odds with what we know about his character from the Gospels we have in our Bible. It's hard to go from turning the other cheek to striking out a kid just for bumping into you on the sidewalk. It's a clear sign that the Gospel of Thomas is inauthentic. But then you have the story of Jesus cursing the fig tree, which did end up in the Gospels of Matthew and Mark. And this is one that, for a long time, I kind of struggled to understand. At first glance, it just seems like Jesus was hangry, as I am if I open my fridge and I don't find anything to eat at 11 p.m. at night. And then he kills the tree. This seems incredibly harsh and seemingly out of line with the other restorative miracles Jesus performed. In fact, the 20th century philosopher Bertrand Russell, who wasn't a Christian, even cited this miracle as part of an argument for why Jesus was not the wisest of all men after all. Now that's a lot of setup I've laid before you just to hammer home this one point. There's really no other miracle that's quite like the cursing of the fig tree in the New Testament that Jesus performed. And even though the passage itself is very short, the event is so unique that I believed it to be worthy of a full class by itself. But what does it mean? Well, I think that this is one of those stories that has multiple meanings, so it's not entirely fair to say that there's just one direct meaning that completely explains the passage. But the interpretation I tend to favor the most is easier to discern if you look at Mark's version of the story. So leave a bookmark on Matthew 21:18, and once you've done that, let's turn over to Mark chapter 11. The story starts in verse 12. I'm not going to read the text here since the major elements of the story are the same compared to Matthew's telling of it. But there's one big difference between the two versions that you can tell just by skimming the passage. What do you think it is?
It wasn't the right season. It said it was not the season for figs.
That's one of the differences. That's not the one I was thinking of, but I do touch on that later on. Here's a hint. Oh, sorry. What? Did someone say something?
They don't see the tree wither right away.
That's true. Yeah. Here's the one I'm thinking about. It has to do with how the story is structured. The big difference that at least I noticed is that in Matthew, the miracle is told as one complete account, but in Mark it's split between two passages with another story placed in the middle. It's not uncommon for the Gospels to switch up the timing of certain events. Although the stories are true, they're not always told in direct chronological order. Sometimes lessons, parables, and miracles are grouped together thematically to emphasize a certain teaching or message. The Gospel of Luke actually does this a lot, but you see it in the others too. And in particular, this practice of cutting up a passage into two parts and sticking another story inside is something Mark does very often, at least 6 times. If he did it just once or maybe twice, we probably wouldn't read too much into it, but it's such a recurring pattern that some biblical scholars have even given it its own fancy name, Markan intercalation. There's a new word for you. The most well-known example of this is probably Mark 5 and verse 21, where Jesus goes to heal the daughter of Jairus. That story starts with Jairus, one of the rulers of the synagogue, imploring Jesus to lay his hand on a sick daughter so that she might recover and live. Then, while Jesus is traveling to the man's house, a woman suffering from a discharge of blood touches his garments and is immediately healed. And then Mark resumes the story of Jesus raising Jairus' daughter. Whenever this happens, there's always some connection between the two stories. Mark is a book that seems kind of simple on the surface. The Greek, as far as I've heard, is relatively basic compared to other classical writings like Paul's letters, or the letter to the Hebrews, or Luke and Acts. But it's a lot more sophisticated than it looks. Back to Mark 11. After Jesus cursed the fig tree, and before he and the disciples returned to see it withered, we have the episode where he cleanses the temple, placed in between the two halves of the story. In Matthew, the two events are also placed next to each other, but the connection is much more obvious in Mark. Can someone read for me Mark 11, verses 15 to 19?
They came to Jerusalem, and he entered the temple and began to drive out those who sold and those who bought in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. And he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. And he was teaching them and saying to them, "Is it not written, 'My house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations'? But you have made it a den of robbers." And the chief priests and the scribes heard it and were seeking a way to destroy him. They feared him because all the crowd was astonished at his teaching. And when evening came, they went out of the city.
At first glance, are there any connections that you see with the fig tree? I have some stuff down, but I wanted to see what you all had to come up with first.
Not sure if this is where you're going or not, but the fig tree was, he wanted figs from it, he didn't have it. So it wasn't doing what it was supposed to do. Whereas the temple, they're doing things in there that they shouldn't be doing. It's not producing what should have been.
Exactly. That's precisely the point I wanted to get across. I think there's a very strong case that the fig tree is meant to parallel the temple that Jesus cleanses. So I did some reading of fig trees in preparation for this class, and one of the things that I learned is that some fig varieties produce fruit before or at the same time that their leaves begin to shoot out. So if you come across a fig tree in leaf, you'll probably expect to see its fruit. And as we see in verse 13, Jesus saw in the distance that the fig tree had leaves, and he walked up closer to see if it had fruit. It didn't, because the fig tree was out of season, but it still had the appearance of having fruit. It looked that way on the outside, but the closer Jesus got, the more he could tell that really the tree didn't produce anything useful, and it was a waste of space. In our language, the words fig leaf actually make up an idiom, which I didn't know about, but apparently it exists. A fig leaf is basically a method of obscuring something that's considered shameful or embarrassing with something else that is completely innocuous. That idiom actually comes from Genesis 3, where Adam and Eve, after eating the forbidden fruit, covered themselves up in fig leaves to hide their nakedness. As a modern example, like a literary work that has something offensive in it might be cleaned up to make it look nice. We'd call that a fig leaf edition of that work. In fact, one of my favorite books of all time is a mystery novel named And Then There Were None. That was not the original title of the book, and I learned that a lot later on. In the same sense, the fig tree that Jesus cursed was full of leaves, but they only served to hide an embarrassing truth, that this tree didn't have any fruit at all. That's what this temple was. It had the outward appearance of a holy place or a house of prayer on the outside, but walk through the doors and you find a den of robbers, money changers, and all sorts of disruptive commercial activities. The punishment for this is serious, and with good reason. People went to a temple for spiritual fulfillment and as a means of growing their relationship with God. I like to think of 1 Samuel, where Hannah goes to the temple. She's like weeping and crying, praying for God to help deliver her a child. So that's a really important need that the temple met back then. But if the temple is as hopelessly corrupt as this one was, it not only condemns itself, but it actively interrupts the relationship other people are trying to grow with God. In verse 18, it says that the chief priests and the scribes sought a way to destroy Jesus after the cleansing of the temple. They feared him because the crowd was astonished at his teaching. So presumably, the people as a whole were also disillusioned with the state of the temple. And I read an interpretation that the curse of the fig tree could also be seen as a prophetic event foretelling the eventual fall of the Jerusalem temple in 70 AD. And given the connection between the two stories, I think that reading makes a lot of sense. I've been discussing the Jewish temple, but much of what I've said could also be applied to churches that don't function as a church ought to. Plenty of churches look nice on the outside, but if they bear no fruit on the inside, how can people possibly feel encouraged enough to keep pursuing a relationship with God there? And some people can even get discouraged from Christianity altogether because of what goes on in a given church. That's why God holds such high standards for what a church is and what its leadership should look like in 1st and 2nd Timothy. And it's why Paul wrote so many letters to address vital church issues like division. Up until now, we've kind of dealt with institutions like the temple and the church, but there's still a little bit more to the passage that I'd like to glean from. But before I move on, are there any comments that y'all would like to add? Okay. Fig imagery is prevalent enough in the Bible that I don't think it's a coincidence that Jesus picked a fig tree to make an example out of. In particular, the tree and its fruit were often used in the Old Testament to represent the nation of Israel. So turn over me to Hosea in chapter 9. We're going to take a little trip through a couple of these fig tree metaphors, and then we'll circle back to Mark 11. Hosea is a book that takes kind of a pessimistic view of Israel for the most part. And the common theme throughout is Israel's habit of following after other false gods rather than the true creator, which is symbolized in the first few chapters by an unfaithful wife. That's not the only analogy God uses, though. Can someone read Hosea 9 and verse 10 for me?
Like
Thank you. Although, as you can probably tell, the Lord was angry at Israel at the time Hosea was written, he remarks that when he found the fathers of the nation, my personal guess is the patriarchs, it was like discovering a fig tree that had produced fruit for the very first time. Do any of you grow fruit in your garden? You know? Well, I don't. I was just hoping someone would have. But basically, the question I was going to ask if someone had raised their hand was, what was it like seeing this plant that you've grown and watered and paid attention to finally start to produce good fruit? It's like, I don't know. It's like, I guess, like a drawing or what. For me, it would be like a drawing, because in my spare time, I'd like to draw, but I'd like labor after this a long time, and like day after day or whatever. And then whenever I see the whole thing start to look like the thing I've actually been drawing and not like a scribble of lines, like there's really a nice sense of like joy and like satisfaction that comes out of that. And I imagine that's probably the emotion, like the kind of emotion that God felt when he first spoke with Abraham and the patriarchs, and then Moses before him. Noah before him. So at first, Israel's faith was like this, but that didn't last. Turn over to Micah chapter 7. This will be our second and final passage before we head back to Mark. Micah chapter 7. Can someone read for me verses 1 and 2 of the chapter?
Woe is me, for I have become as when the summer fruit has been gathered, as when the grapes have been gleaned. There is no cluster to eat, no first ripe fig that my soul desires. The godly has perished from the earth, and there is no one upright among mankind. They all lie in wait for blood, and each hunts the other with a net.
Thank you. So here the connection between Israel's spiritual condition and figs is far more obvious. By this point in time, the nation was far enough from God that there were no figs left to gather. And in that light, the fig tree in Mark 11 seems like some kind of reference to Israel. Turn back over there for me, and I'll start to flesh out this picture a bit more. If you look at the whole chapter of Mark 11, you'll see that both the cursing of the fig tree and the cleansing of the Jewish temple occur immediately following the triumphal entry, which is where Jesus made his prophesied arrival in Jerusalem, the old capital of the nation of Israel. And it was here that Jesus essentially made public his claim to be the Messiah and the King of Israel, following very much in David's footsteps. The people seem to recognize this, as we see in verses 9 and 10. And those who went before and those who followed were shouting, "Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David. Hosanna in the highest." And then the very next thing that we read after this, that the new king of Israel does, is curse a tree that was historically used to represent Israel in the old prophetic texts. And then he's out flipping tables and driving the money changers out from the Jewish temple in the center of Jerusalem. I believe that what we have here is more than enough to conclude that in addition to criticizing the practices of this specific temple, Jesus was making a bold statement about Israel's unsatisfactory worship of the Lord. The holy city of Jerusalem was not nearly as holy or as righteous as its reputation might suggest, which goes back to this whole analogy about fig leaves hiding the lack of desirable fruit. And what happens if Israel keeps failing to produce fruit? Well, Jesus cursing the fig tree is practically a flashing neon warning sign, pointing at where that road ultimately leads. I have a couple more sections to cover up, but any further comments before we move on? Yes, Dave.
I was thinking about this and how, patient Jesus is, even though he does something very drastic in performing this miracle. But at the end, if we don't recognize, if we're making a quick application for ourselves, if we don't recognize ourselves as not producing fruit,
Exactly.
Great on the outside, but awful on the inside.
Exactly. So I guess much of what we've been doing in kind of the first 20 minutes or so of this class has been it's been rather like pointing the finger at certain institutions or people or even the entire nation of Israel for their unfaithfulness. But this lesson isn't really a proper lesson unless you're also pointing that finger at yourself and looking for ways you can really take this to heart. The appearance of being religious is nice, but it really amounts to nothing if there's no fruit behind it. In fact, it can sometimes be worse than nothing because you've now made a false example that can actually harm other people's relationships with God. Any other comments? Yes.
Well, sometimes a huge tragedy in your life can help you look hard at yourself and see, am I really being honest with representing Christ in a way that's pleasing to Him and not, any other way. And I have much greater respect for him talking about how suffering is everything. Without it, you can't grow, you can't learn to move forward. I mean, you just can't, But it really can help you take a very hard look at yourself in a very good way.
Exactly. Like, Jesus cursing a fig tree, like, it's shocking. Like, it stands out. It's very much unlike a lot of the other miracles that Jesus does in the New Testament. But it's shocking, like, precisely for that reason, that, like, this is what awaits if we only say that we're religious, and not necessarily put forth the practice that deserves.
I was just thinking, I think it seems more drastic because as far as we know, this is the first time he's seen the tree and it is condemned right then for not having fruit. But I think what you were fleshing out with comparing it with the temple and the Jews makes a lot of sense because they have known about Jesus longer than anyone, and they're the ones that are getting ready to crucify him, and they are, basically cutting off their own feet in this action that they're doing, but not even realizing it. It's really sad.
Exactly. And then it further goes to show this whole point of like the fig has been used to represent Israel for a long time. It's not necessarily about this specific tree, but like the fig itself, like the fig in general, like all of this has been kind of building up, and I view this as kind of like Jesus marching straight into the heart of Israel and just saying, all right, your hearts are far from me. That's what it is. You say you love me and you say you worship me, but that's not true. And so I feel like, although it looks drastic, like it's not as sudden an action as perhaps immediately reflects. So there are a lot of solutions to the problem of unfaithfulness and the problem of not living out the life that you say you practice. But all of those solutions have to do with one very basic teaching, which is very simple: have faith in God. Let's read the second half of the story of Jesus cursing the fig tree to kind of bear this out a little more. Can I get someone to read from Mark chapter 11, verses 20 to 25?
As they passed by in the morning, they saw the fig tree withered away to its roots. And Peter remembered and said to him, Rabbi, look, the fig tree that you cursed has withered. And Jesus answered them, have faith in God. Truly I say to you, whoever says to this mountain, be taken up and thrown into the sea, and does not doubt in his heart, but believes that what he says will come to pass, for it will be done for him. Therefore I tell you, whatever you ask in prayer, believe that you have received it, and it will be
Thanks, Ian. At first, it seems really weird that when the disciples brought up the withered fig tree, Jesus answered, "Have faith in God." I imagine that the disciples were probably confused at what this had to do with the tree he just cursed. But now that we've kind of gotten the big picture overview, his response makes so much more sense. He's quite literally telling us how we can bear the fruit of faithfulness that this tree, the temple, the nation of Israel, and so many self-described followers of God lack. But we can't just have faith in certain circumstances, like when we show up to a church and pack the seats on a Sunday morning. That faith has to be a part of our whole lives. We're not going to be able to look at God on Judgment Day and say we got caught at the wrong time, in the wrong season. Excuses aren't going to pass muster if you've been given any opportunity at all to display your faith. I found this quote from a Spanish theologian when doing my final preparation for the study that I think states the point I made quite nicely. Jesus curses the fig tree because in it he has found only the appearance of fruitfulness, many leaves. Let this be a lesson to us. There is no excuse for being unproductive. Some might say, I don't know enough, but that is no excuse. Or else, I am unwell, I haven't much talent, the conditions are not right, my surroundings. These aren't excuses either. How pitiful the man who adorns himself with the foliage of a false apostolate, who has all the outward appearance of living a fruitful life, but is not sincerely attempting to yield fruit. Some of the excuses there actually kind of remind me of Moses' excuses in Exodus. Like, that was the first thing that came to mind when I read the part about I haven't much talent. And like, to each what is given, much what is expected, or whatever the saying is. Like, whatever opportunities we have, we can't ever say that we've had too few. We have enough to be able to, we have enough to be able to practice, to be able to live out the life that God has given us. So, I ended up a little bit earlier than I was hoping to, but before we wrap up for tonight, it is worth taking a step back and approaching kind of the remarkable depth that this strange story about a fig tree has. And it's a miracle that many people, many non-Christians really, have tried to poke holes into it because they read it on the surface and they come away thinking Jesus is acting in a very un-Jesus-like way. But if you take the passage and relate it to its surrounding context as it was originally intended, Jesus' actions are in fact very consistent and intentional to prompt a thoughtful response from us. And that response ought to be a full expression of faith, the bearing of fruit, with no excuse and no hesitation. Just have faith in God. I will let you all have the last word if there are any final comments that y'all would like to bring up. Yes, Jay.
Yeah, you were headed right there. One of the things that I saw where right after it says have faith in God, in verse 23, truly I say to you, whoever says to this mountain be taken up and cast into the sea, and does not doubt in his heart, but believes that what he says is going to happen, it will be granted him. So he asked them to have faith. I think the idea was that there was this thought that the great rabbis and the Jewish leaders of the day could do anything and solve these great problems and mysteries and could move a mountain. So that was the idea. We use the expression now, still today. You move mountains, you'll do whatever you can. We don't have anything recorded that he physically ever moved a mountain and dropped it into the sea, but he could have. So I think that's the point to say, I'm not going to do those great big miracles for you that maybe everybody will believe, maybe. But instead, here's what I'm going to do. Have faith. But I can do any of those other things too.
Exactly. Did someone else raise their hand? Oh, yeah. Tyler.
In 11:11 it says Jesus went into Jerusalem and then he went to the temple and he looked around at everything, but it was already late, so he left. That kind of just makes me think of like just a weird example that popped into my head. Down the road they're setting up for Baldwin Days for the weekend, and there's thought and there's preparation that goes into that. So when I think about this verse, it makes me think, okay, these people that were in the temple, you know, they didn't just show up with their cows and their whatever in the morning. They might have, sure. But to me,
seems like I have it a lot, where people like hypothetical questions. And, you know, there's always a hypothetical. There's always like, what about the person on the deserted island who never has a chance to hear about Jesus? What about that person? Are they going to go to heaven or hell or whatever? There's all kinds of these ones. But one of the hypotheticals that comes up a lot is, what about a person who is old and feeble and in a nursing home, and they've got hospice care, and this person says, I'm about to die and I want to be a Christian and I want to be baptized, but they can't be baptized before they die. They die before that's too late. And it's like, this is one of those things that comes up again. It's like, what's going to happen to that person? Because they had their faith, and what happened to this person? And I think that this story might have some kind of an answer in that. Like, hey, you had your entire life to bear fruit, your entire life. And, you know, it's not God's fault that you waited to the 11th hour to make this decision before it was too late. And since I was thinking of this earlier, let's go to Isaiah 5. Are you done? Do you have more to cover?
Oh, that's fine. That's it. You can.
Okay, let's go to Isaiah 5. I think Isaiah 5 applies, it's a vineyard. It's not a fig tree, but it's still the same idea of plant. And the thing about Isaiah 5, it's kind of long. We'll read verses 1 through 7. But the thing that you're seeing in this is true for our lives. It's God saying to Israel, I gave you every opportunity. And then when I was ready to be done with you, I gave you even more opportunity after that. And you had every chance and every opportunity in your life, and you missed it. It's over. So maybe we can read verses 1 through 7, but the main point, after we read it, I think the main point is for us to read this thing, the parable of the fig tree, and not say, well, someday I know I need to get my life right, and I hope that I have time before I die. No, this is the time you have right now. Like you have every opportunity right now to get your life right with God. Do you want to read it? Do you want to read verses 1 through 7?
Okay. 5. Let's just say 5, 1 through 7.
Yeah.
Let me sing for my beloved my love song concerning his vineyard. My beloved had a vineyard on a very fertile hill. He dug it and cleared it of stones and planted it with choice vines. He built a watchtower in the midst of it and hewed out a wine vat in it. And he looked for it to yield grapes, but it yielded wild grapes. And now, O inhabitants of Jerusalem and men of Judah, judge between me and my vineyard. What more was there to do for my vineyard that I have not done in it? When I looked for it to yield grapes, why did it yield wild grapes? And now I will tell you what I will do to my vineyard. I will remove its hedge, and it shall be devoured. I will break down its wall, and it shall be trampled down. I will make it a waste, it shall not be pruned or hoed. And briars and thorns shall grow up. And I will also command the clouds that they rain no rain upon it. For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah are his pleasant painting. And he looked for justice, but behold, bloodshed, for righteousness, but behold, an outcry. That actually really goes along with the parable. So like Luke doesn't record Jesus cursing the fig tree, but he does have a parable about a barren fig tree. I believe it's Luke 13. Yeah, it is. Luke 13 and verse 6. And he told this parable. A man had a fig tree planted in his vineyard, and he came seeking fruit on it and found none. And he said to the vine dresser, Look, for 3 years now I have come seeking fruit on this fig tree, and I find none. Cut it down. Why should it use up all the ground? And he answered him, Sir, let it alone this year also until I dig around it and put on manure. Then, if it should bear fruit next year, well and good. But if not, you can cut it down. And I think that passage really goes to show, elaborate on kind of what your point was, that like God has given us time, and then more time. So like we've had the opportunity. Like we shouldn't save everything until the 11th hour before we do it, because there's no guarantee that that 11th hour happens. Any last comment? Yeah.
Well, the 11th hour, this parable that we start off with the triumphal entry, which basically is his 11th hour, right? He's coming up to the end of his ministry, the end of his life, and then he sees this fig tree. He thinks it's going to, at first maybe he sees it, he's like, yeah, you know, I don't know anything about figs. I like fig Newtons, but peaches. I like peaches in the summertime, and Edgar's peaches at Snooks. They're the best. But when they're no good anymore, they're no good. Then you get upset, you know, because you got one that's all waxy and hard, gross. But you know, he cursed the fig tree, and then he goes in and overturns the tables and all that. It's very similar to what we talked about this being the last hour. It's too late. I'm sorry.
Nick.
I thought it was interesting that you talked about sort of the perceptions of this story in the very beginning, and obviously we read it and we try to understand what Jesus is saying, but the story in the middle of him overturning the tables in the temple is also a story that people point to and say, oh, you know, this Jesus, you know, criticize his character, or, you know, you use it to point out some anti-God argument with the story. And I feel like it's interesting that these two stories are back to back, and that some people don't like them or feel like these two stories are out of character for Christ, because I think sometimes a lot of people love the Jesus that waits, and kind of as we talked about in the garden, that, you know, I'm just going to wait, I'm going to give it time, I'm not going to cut it down yet, give it another year, as we just read in Luke. They love that Jesus, the Jesus that waits and is patient, but when it comes time for any sort of judgment, immediately, oh, that's so out of character for God. Oh, I don't like that picture of Jesus that's painting. But I think this is essential to Christ's character, because he is loving and merciful and patient. He shows steadfast love, but he also will not withhold judgment. And so like that is an essential part of his character. And so if we just like the Jesus that, you know, is pretty and good, you know, whatever we think is nice and warm, but we don't like the Jesus that executes judgment, then we don't love Jesus, period. So I kind of want to ask you a follow-up question that go along with that, because you said in the very beginning, you know, you felt kind of uncomfortable with the story. You've obviously put in a ton of research and read a lot about it. How has your thoughts on this story changed after studying for this class?
Well, I would say that like, well, one thing that I would say the one thing that I kind of appreciated the most that I pointed out at the end was like the sheer depth of it. There was a lot more to it than I thought there was, and so I think it kind of like betrayed my own like superficial reading of it at first glance. But also like what you said is that a lot of the stuff that it connects to also very much reinforces the same qualities that Jesus shows in that story. And it kind of shows that like that is part and parcel of who Jesus is. And we can't like isolate the nice and shiny qualities that so many people like to espouse just because it makes them feel better about themselves. But like the same Jesus that said, let him without sin cast the first stone, also said, go and sin no more. That's the same Jesus in that same story, like two or three verses apart.
Just going back to a point that you made previously about the leaves, and it looked like it should have been in fruit. It reminds me of conversations that I've had with buddies who have decided to leave Christ and to go after false doctrine. And a lot of the conversations boil down to wanting to look externally more devout, or external signs think so often we get caught up in the external signs of our faith. Just a really, this isn't wrong or anything, but like we post a bunch on Instagram about Bible verses that we're reading that day, but our lives don't show the Bible verses that we're reading that day. And so I really like the point that you made of just an external sign of faith without actually producing any fruit. So I think you hit the nail on the head there.
I agree. Like, I will say this, like, honestly, like, some of the, like, most, like, unchristian, like, stuff I've read on places like Instagram or whatever, I click on their profile, and a lot of it is people who have Bible verses in their biography. Like, that's a dichotomy that shouldn't happen, and it happens so often. That's a good point. I think maybe we can do one more. Yeah, you.
Faith, basically, Hebrews 11:1 says faith without, faith without works is dead. So, like, people who say they have, oh, I believe in God, I believe He's going to save me, but they only have faith, they don't actually believe in God, or they're not baptized, because faith alone won't save them. You gotta have works with your faith. Because if you don't have works, then what is it? Your faith's dead.
Exactly. Thanks, everyone. I appreciate all the comments.